Destroy him for me.
You already know what to do. When the time comes, call his name inside your heart.
Chibuzo!
Destroy him for me. Those were the words Adaobi whispered as she entered the Dibia's dark shrine, her eyes burning with wickedness. The old man, Nofa, looked at her and smiled slowly. You already know what to do, he said. He began chanting strange incantations as the fire before him rose violently. Then he handed Adaobi a terrible charm wrapped in red cloth. When the time comes, he whispered, call his name inside your heart, and the spirits will answer. Adaobi collected it with trembling hands and left with an evil smile on her face. The next day, Muna sat happily beside Chibuzo at their usual meeting place. They laughed softly, dreaming about marriage and the peaceful life ahead of them. Muna, Chibuzo said gently, I promise you, nobody will ever hurt you again. Muna smiled shyly, but suddenly, the wind roared angrily. The trees shook violently. Dust filled the air. Chibuzo grabbed his chest immediately. Ah! Chibuzo! Muna screamed in panic. His body twisted painfully on the ground. Bones cracked loudly. His fingers bent unnaturally as he cried out in agony. Muna staggered backwards, shaking with fear. Then before her eyes, hair began growing all over his body. His face stretched painfully. And within seconds, Chibuzo transformed into a he-goat. Muna froze. Her brain could not understand what she was seeing. The goat looked at her with frightened human eyes before suddenly trying to run into the bush. No! Chibuzo! Muna cried as she ran after it desperately. Tears streamed heavily down her face as she grabbed the struggling goat and held it tightly. Her entire body trembled with fear. Crying uncontrollably, she tied the goat carefully to a tree, still unable to understand what had just happened. Who did this to you? She sobbed bitterly. Hi besties, before we continue this emotional story, kindly subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so. Please like, share, and comment your thoughts. What do you think will become the fate of Chibuzo? Now come with me as I take you through this heartbreaking story. The elders used to say that sometimes, joy enters a home carrying sorrow quietly behind it. Nobody understood those words until the day Muna was born. Ezin, Muna's mother, was a kind and gentle woman loved by everyone around her. She spoke softly, respected people deeply, and never returned evil for evil. For many years, she prayed endlessly for a child. Every market day, every planting season, every new moon, she cried before God for the fruit of the womb. Even if it is only one child, she would whisper tearfully to her husband, my heart will be satisfied. Obayoma loved his wife deeply. To him, Ezin was more precious than gold. Whenever people mocked them for not having children, he always defended her. My wife is enough for me, he would say proudly. Then one morning, after many years of waiting, Ezin discovered she was pregnant. The entire compound erupted with joy. Women danced. Men slaughtered goats. Even the old women who had lost hope began smiling again. Obayoma carried his wife in excitement like a child. Ezin. God has finally remembered us. For months, he treated her like an egg that must not break. He refused to let her carry heavy loads. He cooked for her badly sometimes, and they would both laugh whenever he burned the soup. But fate had prepared pain quietly in the shadows. The night Ezin went into labor, heavy rain beat violently against the rooftops. Thunder shook the sky as her cries filled the compound. Oh! Obayoma! The midwives moved around in panic. She is losing strength. Push, Ezin. Push. Outside the room, Obayoma paced restlessly like a man losing his mind. Then finally, the cry of a baby filled the air. A baby girl, one of the women announced. But something was wrong. The room suddenly became silent. Too silent. Obayoma's heart began to race. He rushed inside immediately. Ezen. No response. Ezen. Her body lay still. Cold. Lifeless. Obayoma stared at his wife in disbelief before falling beside her body. No, no, you cannot leave me like this. He carried her lifeless body and cried like a child. Meanwhile, the newborn baby lay quietly beside her dead mother, unaware that tragedy had welcomed her into the world. Outside, the women whispered among themselves. She killed her mother during birth. Such a terrible beginning. And from that very day, Muna entered the world carrying sorrow she did not understand. Raising her alone became difficult for Obayoma. He loved his daughter deeply, but exhaustion slowly swallowed him. Sometimes he carried baby Muna on his back to the farm while walking under the hot sun. Sometimes he cooked meals so badly that neighbors laughed at him. Obayoma, is this food or charcoal? One man joked. Even in his pain, Obayoma laughed weakly. At times, kind neighbors helped him care for the child. At other times, people mocked him openly. You need another wife, they kept telling him. At least the little girl needs a mother. But Obayoma always shook his head. No one can replace Ezen. Still, loneliness has a way of weakening even the strongest hearts. The pressure became too much. Caring for Muna alone became harder each day. And eventually, Obayoma agreed to remarry. The elders always say that not every smiling face carries a clean heart. Some people enter your home with honey in their mouths and poison hidden inside their souls. That was how Adaobi entered Obayoma's life. The day she arrived, she looked like a woman sent from heaven itself. Elegant. Soft-spoken. Always smiling politely. She greeted everyone respectfully and knelt before the elders with humility that impressed the entire compound. Obayoma is lucky, the women whispered. She is a good woman. Even little Mona quickly grew attached to her. Adaobi carried her often, braided her hair gently, and called her sweet names. My daughter, come and eat. At night, she cooked delicious meals that filled the compound with rich aroma. After Obayoma returned from the farm tired and dusty, Adaobi would wash his feet carefully and massage them lovingly. Obayoma's heart finally found peace again. For the first few months, Adaobi acted perfectly. Too perfectly. But evil people can only pretend for so long before their true nature begins to leak out. One morning, while helping in the kitchen, little Mona mistakenly dropped a cup. Crash! The sound startled everyone. Before the frightened child could apologize, Adaobi slapped her hard across the face. Paw! The little girl staggered backwards in shock, holding her cheek. Even Adaobi herself paused briefly, realizing what she had done. Mona stared at her silently, tears gathering in her eyes. That was the first time Adaobi had ever touched her with anger. Later that evening, Adaobi pinched Mona painfully while nobody was watching. Useless child, she hissed quietly. Mona winced in pain. As days passed, the insults increased. Your mother died because of you. You bring bad luck into this house. You are nothing but a burden. Mona cried often, but Obayoma rarely saw it. Adaobi was too clever. The moment Obayoma returned home, she immediately changed into a loving wife again. Sometimes she would quickly pull Mona close and smile warmly. Mama is only correcting you because she loves you. Obayoma believed every word. Slowly, Mona's childhood began disappearing. Then Adaobi became pregnant. And from that moment, Mona stopped being treated like a child. She became a servant. Every morning before sunrise, Adaobi's voice would thunder through the compound. Muna! Fetch water. Muna! Sweep the house. Muna! Wash these clothes. The little girl worked endlessly. She fetched water until her neck ached. washed piles of clothes with tiny hands, cooked, swept, worked on the farm, carried heavy firewood bigger than her small body. Sometimes she staggered under the weight while Adaobi watched without pity. If she made even the slightest mistake, punishment followed immediately. Sometimes Adaobi beat her with broomsticks. Sometimes with bare hands. Sometimes she pressed hot spoons against her skin. Muna suffered quietly because nobody listened to her cries. Yet whenever Obioma returned home exhausted from the farm, Adaobi would suddenly begin acting weak and tired. She would sigh dramatically and rub her waist. "Muna barely helps me," she lied softly. Obioma frowned in disappointment. "Muna," he said angrily one evening, "why are you stressing your mother?" The little girl opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She only lowered her head slowly as tears gathered in her eyes. Because no matter how much she suffered, nobody believed her. The elders say that favoritism can destroy a home faster than fire. Once a wicked heart chooses one child over another, peace quietly leaves the household. That was exactly what happened after Adaobi gave birth to her daughter. The day baby Ijeoma entered the world, Adaobi celebrated as though a princess had been born from heaven itself. Songs filled the compound. Visitors came bearing gifts. Adaobi glowed with pride as she carried the child everywhere. "My daughter will never suffer," she boasted proudly. And truly, Ijeoma grew up like royalty inside the house. Beautiful clothes wrapped around her tiny body. Soft meals specially prepared for her. Beads and jewelry decorated her neck and wrist. If she cried, Adaobi ran immediately. If she coughed, the whole house panicked. Meanwhile, Muna slowly became invisible. If food remained after everyone finished eating, she could eat. If not, she slept hungry. Sometimes she sat quietly outside at night, holding her stomach while listening to Adaobi and Ijeoma laughing inside. Adaobi constantly compared the two girls. "Look at my daughter," she would say proudly. "Then look at you." Sometimes she laughed cruelly. "Even goats are prettier." The words wounded Muna deeply, but she endured them silently. As Ijeoma grew older, she began copying her mother's wickedness perfectly. She insulted Muna daily and mocked her torn clothes whenever visitors came around. "See your life," she would laugh. "You look like a housemaid." Sometimes, after Muna finished cleaning the house, Ijeoma deliberately poured water on the floor again. "Muna," she would shout mockingly. "Come and clean this place properly." Then Adaobi would join in laughing while Muna quietly cleaned the mess again. The two treated her like a slave instead of family. But suffering could not destroy the goodness inside Muna. As years passed, she grew into a beautiful young woman. Quiet, hardworking, gentle, respectful. Even in hardship, there was something graceful about her that people could not ignore. Whenever she greeted elders respectfully, they smiled warmly. Some women even whispered secretly among themselves, "That girl has a pure heart. She resembles her late mother." One evening, Obioma sat outside with his old friend, Nana. The night was quiet, but Obioma's face looked troubled. He sighed deeply. "Nana, I do not like the way Adaobi treats Muna." Nana nodded slowly as if he had expected those words for a long time. "She fears your first daughter," he replied carefully. Obioma lowered his head sadly. "Muna is all Ezen left behind. Before my wife died, I promised myself I would protect that child." His voice became firmer. "If Adaobi does not change, I will send her back to her father's house." Unfortunately, someone standing nearby heard every single word. Adaobi. The tray she was carrying nearly slipped from her hands as anger burned inside her chest. "So, after everything, he wants to disgrace me because of that girl." Her eyes darkened slowly. And from that very moment, murder entered her heart. The elders say that when jealousy enters the heart of a wicked person, even blood becomes cheap. That night, Adaobi could not sleep. She lay awake on her mat, staring into darkness while anger burned violently inside her chest. So he wants to disgrace me, she muttered bitterly. So he wants to send me away because of that girl? The more she thought about it, the darker her heart became. Before morning, hatred had already turned into murder inside her mind. At sunrise, Adaobi secretly made her way to the hut of a feared Dibia named Nofa. Even adults mentioned his name carefully. People whispered terrible stories about him. Some said he buried charms inside human skulls. Others claimed he spoke with spirits at midnight. Children feared walking near his shrine. As Adaobi entered, the smell of smoke and strange herbs filled the air. Nofa looked at her quietly. "What do you want?" he asked. Adaobi swallowed hard before speaking. "I want poison." The old Dibia smiled darkly. "For who?" "My husband." Nofa laughed slowly, the kind of laugh that sends fear into the heart. "Nothing is free," he said. He demanded either a huge ransom or her body. Adaobi hesitated briefly, shame flashing across her face. But greed defeated shame. She agreed. Afterward, Nofa prepared a deadly poison inside a small container and handed it to her carefully. "Mix only a little inside his food," he warned. "He will sleep and never wake again." Adaobi collected it with trembling hands and hurried home. That evening, Obioma returned tired from work while Muna served food quietly. Adaobi smiled sweetly as she secretly poured the poison into his meal. Obioma ate peacefully, unaware that death sat inside his food. At one point, he looked at Muna and smiled warmly. "My daughter, tomorrow we will visit your father's farmland together." Muna's face brightened immediately. "Really, Papa?" Obioma nodded softly. "Yes." But unknown to both of them, tomorrow would never come. That night, Obioma slept peacefully beside his wife. And never woke again. Morning came with screams. The entire house exploded with mourning. Muna shook her father desperately. "Papa! Papa, wake up!" Her cries pierced through the compound. Meanwhile, Adaobi rolled on the ground dramatically, crying louder than everyone else. "My husband has left me. What will I do now?" Villagers gathered and pitied her deeply. Nobody suspected anything. Nobody except Muna, who noticed something strange. Each time people looked away, Adaobi's tears disappeared too quickly. After Obioma's burial, Adaobi dropped every pretense completely. Her cruelty became worse. Muna now woke before sunrise and slept long after midnight. Every day was filled with endless suffering. She worked without rest. Without appreciation. Without love. Sometimes, without even eating. "Muna, fetch water. Muna, grind the pepper. Muna, go to the farm." Her body grew tired, but Adaobi never cared. Meanwhile, Adaobi and Ijeoma seized Obioma's farmland completely. Anytime Muna tried to speak about it, Adaobi shouted angrily. "You own nothing here. You are only surviving because I allow it." Many nights, Muna cried herself to sleep quietly, hugging herself in darkness while everybody else slept peacefully. But despite everything, she remained kind. One afternoon, while walking sadly along a narrow path toward the farm, Muna began singing a sorrowful song her late mother used to sing. Her voice carried so much pain that even the birds nearby became strangely quiet. At that same moment, a wealthy businessman named Chibuzo was passing through the village for business. The moment he heard her voice, he stopped walking. Then he saw her. Beautiful. Natural. Graceful even in suffering. Muna quickly became frightened and tried to leave, but Chibuzo spoke gently. "Please, you are safe." Muna stopped slowly. "Why are you crying?" he asked softly. But Muna could barely speak through her tears. Something about her pain touched Chibuzo deeply. Before leaving, he smiled warmly. "Meet me here tomorrow." But the next day, Muna forgot completely. Adaobi buried her in endless chores from morning till evening. Fetching water, grinding food, cleaning, farm work. By the time night came, she suddenly remembered and felt terrible. Meanwhile, Chibuzo had waited for hours. Still, fate was not finished with them. Days later, they met again unexpectedly along the same path. This time, Chibuzo refused to let her disappear so easily. He walked beside her patiently and listened quietly as she slowly opened up emotionally. Not fully, but enough. And from that moment, love began quietly between them. Chibuzo admired her humility and strength. Muna admired his kindness and gentle heart. And for the first time in many years, Muna smiled genuinely. Muna did not know that the little peace entering her life was already being watched by darkness. One evening, as they walked together along the narrow path, Chibuzo suddenly stopped and looked directly into Muna's eyes. "I will marry you," he said boldly. Muna froze completely. "Me?" she asked softly, almost in disbelief. Nobody had ever chosen her before. Nobody had ever looked at her with love instead of pity. That same day, Chibuzo followed her home. The moment Adaobi saw his expensive clothes, shining wristwatch, and confident appearance, her eyes widened slightly. "This man is wealthy," she thought immediately. And at once, greed woke up inside her heart. Adaobi quickly pretended to be caring and welcoming. "My son, you are welcome," she said sweetly. But before long, she began lying against Muna. "Muna is lazy. She is stubborn. She cannot take care of a husband." Then she proudly pushed Ijeoma forward. "My daughter is more suitable for a man like you." Ijeoma smiled shyly, pretending to be innocent. But Chibuzo simply smiled calmly. "I know exactly who I want." Those words pierced Adaobi's heart like a knife. Before leaving, Chibuzo stood confidently and announced, "I will return in 3 days with my people." Muna's heart overflowed with joy. But Adaobi's heart burned with hatred. That same evening, Adaobi rushed back to the Dibia's shrine. "I want him destroyed," she said bitterly. Nofa smiled knowingly. "You already know what to do." He prepared a terrible charm and began chanting strange incantations. Then he handed her a dangerous object wrapped in red cloth. "When the time comes," he warned, "the spell will change him completely." Adaobi collected it with trembling hands and left with evil excitement burning inside her. The next day, Muna and Chibuzo sat happily at their usual meeting place. They laughed softly while dreaming about marriage and the peaceful future ahead of them. Suddenly, the wind roared violently. The trees began shaking aggressively. Chibuzo grabbed his chest immediately. "Oh! Chibuzo!" Muna screamed in panic. His body twisted painfully on the ground. Bones cracked loudly. He screamed in agony as his body began changing before her eyes. Muna staggered backwards in terror. Then suddenly, Chibuzo transformed into a he-goat. Silence fell. Muna's brain could not process what she had just seen. The goat looked at her with frightened human eyes before suddenly trying to run into the bush. "No! Chibuzo!" Muna cried desperately as she ran after it. Trembling violently, she grabbed the struggling goat and held it tightly while tears poured heavily down her face. Crying uncontrollably, she tied the goat carefully to a nearby tree, still unable to understand what had just happened. Even when darkness changes everything, a faithful heart still remembers who it loves. That was how Muna loved Chibuzo, even after he became a goat. That night, while everybody slept, Muna secretly stole food from the kitchen and quietly returned to the tree where she had tied the goat. The moment the goat saw her, it moved closer immediately. Muna knelt beside him with trembling hands. "Papa! Mama, please help me," she cried bitterly. "I cannot suffer like this forever." The goat looked at her with eyes filled with human sadness. At one point, it slowly rested its head on her shoulder as if trying to comfort her. Muna broke down crying harder. Still, even inside the pain, there were moments that made her laugh helplessly. The goat refused to eat certain vegetables and pushed them away stubbornly. "Chibuzo, even as a goat, you are still difficult," Muna said through tears. At another point, the goat suddenly heard Adaobi's voice from far away and aggressively headbutted a nearby tree. "Third." Muna burst into laughter despite her pain. "You are still stubborn even as a goat," she said softly. For a few moments, her laughter eased the sadness inside her heart. But peace never stays long around wicked people. The next morning, Muna returned again with more food, unaware that Adaobi and Ijeoma had secretly followed her. The two hid behind bushes, watching everything carefully. The moment they saw Muna feeding the goat gently, they burst into loud wicked laughter. "A human being feeding a goat like a husband," Adaobi mocked. Ijeoma began making loud goat sounds. "Mia! Mia! You are truly mad," they laughed cruelly. Muna immediately stood up in shame and fear. But suddenly, something changed. The wind stopped moving completely. The atmosphere became strangely cold. Even the laughter died immediately. Then slowly, something appeared. As the strange coldness filled the air, two glowing figures slowly appeared before them. Muna's late parents. Radiant. Powerful. Terrifying. Muna gasped loudly and collapsed to her knees in shock. "Mama! Papa!" Adaobi and Ijeoma screamed in terror and staggered backwards immediately. Obayoma's spirit pointed angrily at Adaobi, his voice shaking the air around them. "You destroyed this family." Adaobi trembled violently. Meanwhile, Ezin's spirit moved toward Muna and stood protectively beside her like a mother shielding her child. Then suddenly, a bright light surrounded the goat. The wind roared loudly. Moments later, the goat began changing. Bones cracked. Lights flashed again. And before everybody's eyes, Chibuzo transformed back into a human being. Muna screamed in overwhelming joy and rushed into his arms, crying uncontrollably. "Chibuzo!" But suddenly, Adaobi began screaming painfully. "Ah! Leave me alone." Something invisible tormented her violently. Then the confessions began pouring out of her mouth against her will. "I killed Obayoma. I poisoned him. I turned Chibuzo into a goat. I worked with Nofa." Muna froze completely. Her entire world shattered instantly. At that exact moment, two men passing nearby witnessed everything. A hunter named Odegu and a farmer named Ibuka. Terrified, Ibuka immediately ran toward the village. "The king must hear this," he shouted. Within a short time, villagers gathered around the scene in shock. Adaobi continued confessing wildly while begging invisible spirits for mercy. People covered their mouths in horror. Then suddenly, the same spiritual power that freed Chibuzo struck Adaobi violently. Her body twisted painfully. And before everyone's eyes, Adaobi transformed into a she-goat. Chaos erupted immediately. Ijeoma screamed endlessly while villagers stumbled backwards in fear. Some laughed nervously in disbelief. Others trembled at the spiritual judgment they had witnessed. The king immediately ordered an investigation, and before sunset, Nofa the Dibia was captured. Inside his shrine, villagers discovered charms, bones, and terrifying evil objects hidden everywhere. Angry voices filled the air as many families began revealing how the Dibia had secretly destroyed lives for years. The king raised his staff angrily. "Evil must not survive among us." And before the entire community, the villagers stoned Nofa to death so he would never live to destroy another family again. Adaobi finally became a living example of that truth. After everything was revealed, the king gave his final judgment. Adaobi and her daughter are banished from this land forever. The villagers watched silently as Adaobi, now trapped inside the body of a goat, was driven out of the community alongside Ijeoma. Ijeoma cried bitterly. "Please forgive us. Please." But nobody pitied them anymore. The wickedness they planted had finally produced fruit. Adaobi wandered helplessly into the forest as a goat, disappearing slowly into darkness. And from that day, nobody ever saw her again. As for Ijeoma, shame followed her everywhere until she eventually disappeared completely from the community. But after years of suffering, joy finally visited Muna. Not long after, Muna and Chibuzo were traditionally married in a celebration the village would never forget. Music filled the air joyfully. Drums echoed through the community. Food overflowed everywhere. Villagers danced endlessly with excitement. Even some elders wiped tears from their eyes while blessing the couple. Muna sat beside Chibuzo glowing with peace and happiness. For the first time since childhood, she truly felt loved. She truly felt she belonged somewhere. As the years passed, Chibuzo restored Obayoma's farmland and handed it back to Muna proudly. "This belongs to you," he said warmly. Together, they became wealthy, respected, and greatly loved in the community. Their home became filled with laughter instead of tears. Children instead of loneliness. Peace instead of fear. But despite all the happiness surrounding her, Muna never forgot her parents. Sometimes late at night, she stood quietly outside beneath the moonlight and whispered softly into the air, "Thank you for saving me." And somewhere beyond the world of the living, two loving spirits smiled proudly at the daughter they never truly left behind.